Welcome to the Expanding Consciousness podcast with your hosts, Michael Wally and Nicholas Haag. In this podcast, we explore ways to sharpen our awareness, make life more enjoyable, be a little kinder, become more authentic, less reactive, more present, and ultimately expand our consciousness. We're happy to have you along for the ride, and if you do enjoy these conversations, please leave a review or a comment, as this goes a long way for us. Enough of the promotional talk and enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. This week we wanted to take a little bit of a deeper dive into different states of the nervous system, and in particular been very interested about this idea called defense cascade. And essentially it's a progression of states of the nervous system that mammals in general may go through. And I feel that this particular model is really useful for understanding, different states that we might find ourselves in due to trauma, and actually what we might experience as we kind of work our way back and start to come out of trauma. Because one of the main points here, I think, is that coming out of the deepest defensive states tends to be very unsettling. And in most forms of therapy, there will be a tendency to kind of actually calm ourselves down when if we actually want to move out of these defense states, we might actually have to move into higher states of activation, and that might look kind of unsettling. And so just to kind of touch on this a little bit before we dive in too much, the idea here is that in the deepest state of defense, we're essentially totally shut down, right? Totally numb. And as we come out of this, first we'll start to become a little bit more kind of almost manic, in the sense that that numbness is still there, but there's also this possibility of being very activated, kind of jumping back into fight or flight response. And then as we move further back, we might even get into, just a straight up fight or flight response, and potentially might be in like a panic mode, right? And so the tendency at that point might be to actually try to calm ourselves down rather than allowing the response to play out, which could be counterproductive in a sense. So yeah, I just kind of wanted to introduce that a little bit, but curious to get any of your thoughts, Nick, or where you want to dive in with this.
That's a really interesting observation. So we talked already in the last episode about PSIP and kind of realized that it's a really interesting model, and that it's a model that has a lot of overlap with polyvagal theory, but it seems that they somehow on their own mapped out the states of the nervous system. So obviously it's super interesting to kind of compare what's going on there and kind of just solidify whatever we already know from polyvagal theory. What is interesting is that they're going deep into mapping out why somebody suppresses trauma. So to understand, for me, a bit better, this concept that you just explained, so the defense cascade, is this talking about something that happens in the nervous system during a traumatic event, or is this something what we talk about when somebody later on tries to bring up that traumatic event?
So initially, the initial impression in the system would be during a traumatic event, but then later it can get stimulated, right? And so the model really applies to both, right? And within the context of trauma and trauma therapy, the insight is that we may actually have to kind of progress backwards through these states in order to kind of fully process and return to homeostasis.
Mm-hmm. So maybe to understand it the best, maybe let's just take an example of and try to understand like how would this work and how would somebody get out of that state again. So for the sake of simplicity, let's just take, I don't know, a really simple example of how somebody experiences trauma, like a car accident. Somebody's driving home on an icy road, lose control over their car, impact, they survive, but they're left traumatized. They later on realize they are limited in the They even go back to driving, but it's never the same as it has been before. Whenever they drive a car, they're always very tense. Their nervous system is very activated, and they realize that it's somehow related to this accident that they had in the past. And then perhaps, they reach out to the PSIP people and say, hey, this is something, I feel that something's going on in my nervous system, which is not dealt with. Perhaps in other psychotherapy modalities, that they had been given a lot of advice about calming the nervous system, like vagus nerve calming, and people just advising them, yeah, your nervous system is activated, we're going to calm it down. However, like if we understand this correctly, this might not be always helpful. And what this person actually needs to do is they actually need to go through some activation and kind of let the trauma response finish, let the nervous system response finish, right? And then we're gonna encounter perhaps the different states of the nervous system. So yeah, maybe let's take it from there. So we have this person that had this traumatic accident, and whenever they come close to a car, they have nervous system activation, and they do anything to kind of avoid it if they can. But now they're here with this intention that they want to process it. So what do you envision what happened for that person in the model?
Yeah. So maybe first it would make sense to kind of go through the different states within the context of the situation that you've kind of put up. So initially, say the person's driving down the road, an icy road, and they're not exactly at homeostasis, state 0. They're probably in like a state 1, which is a kind of activated, agitated, starting to move into a fight or flight type response, right? Just because it's potentially a dangerous situation, and so they're on edge, right? And then they hit a patch of ice and they start losing control. As this happens, they're probably moving into a state 2, which is pretty much a full fight or flight state where their nervous system is like highly activated. They're trying to respond to the danger as quickly as possible. There might be like a little bit of panicking, potentially some like rage or terror, hyperventilation, very fast thinking, right? Their muscles might be kind of tightening up. And then as maybe they start to realize that they can't regain control, then they might start moving, their nervous system might start moving into the state 3, which is kind of this, what I described earlier as like a manic state, where you're kind of in between the freeze response and the fight or flight response, where essentially, your body's kind of starting to numb out and kind of collapse a little bit. But it's still also capable of reactivating, right? And within this particular context, this particular story, I don't know that the person would necessarily reach a state 4. So state 4 is basically where it's just basically kind of game over at that point, and the nervous system just totally shuts down. The large opioid releases. This is basically like there's kind of no way out. It's certainly possible. And maybe they get into an accident and, they spin out and the car maybe rolls or something, and, they try to get out, they try to maybe loosen their seatbelt or something, but they're just trapped, and, it seems like it's over. So maybe they could get into a state 4 in this case, right? And so then, after the fact, when they're kind of approaching a car again, they're potentially going to get re-stimulated, reactivated into one of these states. So let's just say that, okay, maybe they do get reactivated into a state 4 where they kind of just totally numb out, blank out, and it's something that kind of repels them, like going back into the car or something, right? And so at that point, using like the PSIP therapy model, from what I understand, and no expert on this or anything, I read the white paper recently. It's pretty good. Maybe we'll link that in the show notes. But basically the idea would be, using something like cannabis potentially, and being within the therapy context, they would kind of start to revisit this and allow their system to kind of do whatever it's going to do, right? So initially they might kind of be in this very blank, numb, just kind of totally dissociated state 4. And then as sort of the nervous system tries to move back towards homeostasis, they might move kind of back up, and by up meaning they're moving into a higher state of activation into this state 3, where it's kind of a little bit more manic, and it might be kind of waves of potentially like panic or something start coming up, and that's alternating maybe with kind of this dissociated response where they're just kind of numbed out. And in state 3, some of the things that can show up that you don't see in state 4 that can kind of be a little bit off-putting, for example, is like thoughts of suicide. And this is kind of like a biological response. And we've kind of mentioned it before, that kind of the evolutionary purpose of this within the context of say, like a predator-prey type model is essentially to discourage the prey from moving, essentially, right? Because if they're kind of suicidal and very depressed and dissociated, they're going to just freeze. And that may be the most useful response within kind of like the predator-prey model. Might not necessarily be as useful a response in a car accident, or it could be useful in the sense that maybe allowing the body to kind of just go limp might prevent you from causing additional injury while you're, in the midst of a car accident or something, for example. But so after they kind of move back into this almost manic state of waves of a little bit of fight or flight, but also kind of the freeze, then as that progresses and as they allow their body to essentially do what it wants to do. And this is one of the places in particular where the PSIP model kind of differentiates itself from other models. And that's what they call selective inhibition, which is basically intentionally stopping your calming response, right? So we kind of tend to have this higher level calming response where if we notice we're becoming activated or something, we might do something like take a deep breath. We might, do some self-soothing, whether that's like maybe rubbing your hands or something like that. And in most therapy models that I understand, that would kind of be encouraged, right? Like if it seems like the person's starting to become activated, then there'll be some sort of physiological, response to try and calm the person down. And within this model, we're actually saying, okay, what would happen if you don't, take that deep breath? And oftentimes that actually starts moving you into a higher activated state, potentially more agitation. There might be feelings of like, oh, I'm gonna suffocate if I don't take this deeper breath, right? And so it can definitely be very unsettling. But as the person moves further up the activation chain, kind of back through these responses, they'll potentially then be moving into a state 2, which might be characterized by, just straight up panic. Right. So they might be going through some sort of panic attack, panic response. And at this point, the body may actually, kind of borrowing from what Peter Levine often describes. And that's where the body will actually move through potential like physical responses. So for example, if it was a car accident and maybe your body tried to put your arm up to brace yourself to prevent you from hitting the windshield or something, right? And maybe you weren't able to. Maybe your arms were restricted. Maybe the airbag had gone off and you couldn't move your arm. So the body really wanted to do this, but it couldn't do this. Now that you're moving back into this state 2, you might actually have like a physical reaction. Your arms might, jump up as if you were bracing for that car accident, even though, you're outside of it and you're safe. Right. And that might be part of that panic response. There might be some pretty significant physical reactions at that point. And from my understanding, if you just kind of allow this to play out, it can move fairly quickly, like within 30 seconds or a couple of minutes. This state 2, this panic response might start to calm down and move more into agitation. So you might start kind of re-experiencing some of that agitation that you experienced initially just as driving on ice, before the accident actually occurred. And again, kind of just allowing the body to do whatever it wants to do, just kind of move back down and eventually kind of returning to that homeostasis where you're just kind of calmed down. And of course, you might be a little bit tired after moving through all of that, but probably feeling safe and probably starting to kind of just warm up and feel a little bit more comfortable overall. So that's kind of the picture that I would paint using the car accident model.
It sounds really intense, to be honest. Like an intense form of therapy, a little bit maybe like cognitive behavioral therapy, where in some cases they also have this kind of exposure to whatever is causing fear or basically fear. So basically they know that exposing the nervous system to the trigger will not last forever, that there is a process that is happening that will eventually kind of regulate the problem with the trigger. So this model would be suitable for, in your opinion, any kind of trauma that is stuck in, I don't know, in the fight or flight stage, that is stuck in a freeze state, or is this something that is only for trauma that is stuck in a dissociative stage?
So I think it probably is most effective relative to other therapies for people stuck in like the totally dissociated state.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the main kind of departure from other therapies that I understand is essentially kind of almost repressing or inhibiting the calming response. I'm not sure, I know CBT, for example, and some other similar therapies do have this element of exposure, right? But I'm not sure how they typically respond to the activation that results in that exposure, whether they try to just calm at that point. That's kind of my understanding, but if I'm wrong, certainly correct me.
It's like, for example, somebody that has OCD and they have a specific trigger. They need to endure the trigger, basically. So they introduce whatever object it is for the OCD person that is the worst, and they're like, we will go through with this. Like, we will go through this until the nervous system is calm. And it's basically, I think they also go through most of the states that we described, like panic, fear, and whatever, and eventually come back down. I don't know if it goes as far as like the dissociative stage. So yeah, that was just what reminded me of it. But in the case of, for example, illnesses like OCD, where you have a specific trigger, it's kind of easy to, or even with like phobias, somebody's like afraid of spiders, right? We just need a spider and we need to like gradually expose you to get that nervous system reaction. One of the problems with trauma or suppressed trauma is that it's actually not that easy to bring up. So it seems in this model we have a couple of tools to kind of break through the protective layers of the ego for all of this stuff to surface. And in this case, we like purposefully want to break through, kind of to reach the worst state for the processing to happen. But so is it just the fact that they use cannabis, or is there more to it? Like how do we break through these kind of whatever blocks the processing?
Yeah. So I think that cannabis definitely plays a pretty significant role in this, in the sense that it, as we understand, kind of starts to shut down the default mode network, or kind of shuts down some of that, what they refer to as secondary consciousness, which meaning kind of more of that thinking mind. And I think this is maybe one of the other areas where it kind of differentiates from a model like CBT, where CBT is maybe a little bit more cognitively focused, right? I mean, it's in the name, cognitive behavioral therapy, whereas a model like PSIP, using something, I guess you could call it like a catalyst in a sense, using a catalyst like cannabis to kind of bring up that more physiological response, that primary consciousness response. And primary consciousness here kind of referring more to like the animalistic, and just kind of relying on the physiology to kind of return to homeostasis. Whereas when the cognitive type models, maybe it's a little bit more mental heavy, which can potentially kind of inhibit the physiology's mechanisms to return to homeostasis, because there is that tendency to kind of manage ourselves, right, and kind of manage our reaction. So I think that's somewhat somewhat of the biggest difference, but I may not totally be doing it justice. But yeah, that's kind of my overall understanding.
So the inhibition part seems to be key there, because so I'm wondering basically if it's, let's say, just the cannabis kind of doing the work, then I would imagine that everybody who smokes cannabis, would be weeping on the floor and like brought back to their like childhood trauma on a regular basis. Yet this is not what happens. So I guess so. Maybe other factors could be, first of all, I guess, intention. That do this in an intentional way. You perhaps already know like what is the topic that you want to bring up. Perhaps the fact that there's like a caretaker there that you can relate to, that kind of guides you through the process. But that also doesn't, try to calm you down, and like he's kind of there while you're more and more activating, right? This is also kind of their role.
Yeah. So you brought up the really important points. One being kind of the setting, the context, and going into it with the intention and understanding that your nervous system might go through these different states, and it might be kind of unsettling. So I think it's very helpful to understand that as you're going into it. And you mentioned kind of the difference between, well, if it was just the cannabis, then most of us might experience this just smoking cannabis. And the difference really is that, yeah, you have someone there guiding you. You're there with the particular intention and understanding of how it might go. You have someone guiding you and kind of helping you notice and inhibit, because a lot of those calming responses might be very transparent to you. You might not even realize that you're doing it. And so having a guide there that can kind of bring your attention to it and notice, hey, you're self-soothing, what would happen if you didn't do that. But then also one of the other aspects that they really emphasize with this, and why it's particularly good for example, childhood type traumas, is they really emphasize the relational aspect. And the idea there being, maybe if I can kind of paraphrase some of what I've heard from Saj in particular around this model, is basically that many of these wounds and these like childhood traumas came about in a relational context, right? So it was maybe your caregiver that wasn't able to provide sufficient or good enough. I think this phrase is often used, good enough care, good enough responses to you as a child, and eventually you get into these kind of dissociative responses. Well, in order to come out of that, it can be very beneficial to be in relationship with someone else, right, who can potentially absorb some of that transference. So I'm not sure if we haven't quite touched on this in this episode. We might have mentioned it before, but essentially transference being kind of within the psychotherapy model, when essentially you kind of project a role onto the therapist. And so within the context of like childhood therapy, childhood trauma, it might be projecting a role of your parent onto the therapist. And so you might have an array of different responses to the therapist as you're projecting onto them, as you're kind of transferring onto them. And the important part that I understand kind of from the therapist perspective is really kind of just being able to take on that role rather than kind of stopping it in a sense, right? So, and this is kind of called what's called countertransference, as I understand it. So, for example, if the client is projecting onto or transferring onto the therapist a role of, say, like a perpetrator or someone who hurt them, the therapist might kind of want to shut that down, because that can be a very uncomfortable role for someone to put on you when obviously you're not that, right? And so the therapist might kind of try to calm the person down, or say like, oh no, I would never hurt you or something. I think within this model, they're not necessarily feeding into it, so they're not going to like suddenly take on the role of the perpetrator and act all scary or something, but they're not necessarily going to shut it down either. They're kind of just going to allow it and just kind of ask them like, okay, well, what are you experiencing now? How are you seeing me now? And not shut it down. And so that's kind of another important aspect of, in particular, the relational part of the PSIP model.
Sounds very tricky, I think. So I'm wondering, like, if it's in a way also dangerous because you're going with somebody into these deep nervous system states where they're kind of really vulnerable, and then you also need to embody like key figures that happened in the story. I mean, I believe this is probably like part of the training of like what are they able to do, what are they not able to do, like what that kind of thing. But yeah, I think what I want to say is people go into a very vulnerable state, which is a state that usually the nervous system prevents them from going into because they perceive this as like so dangerous that, you know, it is basically traumatic and it was shut off completely. But I believe that you need a lot of trust and a lot of safety to be open enough to say, okay, I'm going with this therapist. I'm going to be basically the most vulnerable I can with this person. So yeah, it's something interesting that happens, but I'm also wondering, like, how do you even foster the relationship to the point where people trust you that much as a therapist?
Yeah, I think those are really good points, and I think that that idea of safety really is key to kind of open people up and allow them to move through these very vulnerable states. And so I would imagine that you really need to spend some time kind of establishing that initially before, you know, as far as I know, you don't necessarily just dive right into a session. You know, you kind of develop a rapport with the therapist and, you know, kind of develop that sense of safety. And totally, I think that it is, you know, not exactly for the faint of heart in some regards. It may be like a very effective model for moving out of especially like relational dissociative states, right? And so it may be one of the best models and one of the, you know, few ways that will actually move you out of that, at least fairly quickly, from what I understand. But I do think that there is, you know, potentially a certain amount of risk, and that's why I think you would generally only want to do this with someone that is pretty well informed and trained and has kind of done the work themselves as well, because as you're kind of alluding to, it does ask a lot of the therapist, right? That they have to be able to potentially take on these roles or take on these projections and, you know, maintain their own regulation, right? Because if they haven't done their own work, these things could be very triggering for them, and it could kind of spiral and, you know, just, I don't know, potentially re-traumatize the person, right? If you're not able to kind of hold space and respond to it, you know, in the most productive way or in kind of the most useful ways, which I think, you know, as I use that phrase, holding space, I think that, you know, something we've talked about a lot before. I think that really is key to helping people move through it.
Mm-hmm. I think what is unique about this model and perhaps about psychedelic therapy or psychedelic assisted therapy in general is that something that is very different from other forms of therapy is that the pre-requirement for somebody to work in this capacity is to have experience in this space. I don't know if it's the case for like all of the modalities, but I'm pretty sure that if you go through PSIP through their school, that you need to have a certain number of experiences yourself with cannabis as kind of from the client perspective. And similarly with like MDMA therapy from MAPS and other psychedelic assisted therapies. And this is, I think it is something really unique. Like before, psychotherapists that give you therapy, they not necessarily have been suffering themselves, been victims, or even been on the other side as a client to understand like what does it feel like. In the same way that a doctor doesn't need to be ill to treat ill people, you know, which also makes sense. But if we're talking about like these high vulnerability states, dissociation, and we're talking about an external tool that brings you into an expanded state of consciousness and so on, I cannot imagine. I think it would be even dangerous to, you know, if you would have, for example, PSIP facilitators that never smoke cannabis in their life, that never have been through this cycle of up and down through the nervous system.
Yeah. Oh, I totally agree. And honestly, I would even say, even if it's just talk therapy, that the most effective therapist is going to be one who has already gone through their own therapy and has already processed a lot of their own stuff. Because, I think it really makes it challenging to hold space for someone else when it ends up triggering your stuff that you haven't worked through,
Mm-hmm.
right? And, to be honest, at least from my perspective, I think that we all have some degree of trauma, right? And it doesn't necessarily, like you said, it doesn't necessarily have to match what the client is going through, but you just have to be able to really maintain your own kind of regulated state, right? Because in a lot of ways, as a client is going through these different, kind of unsettling states of their nervous system, they're relying upon the therapist for regulation, right? Within like polyvagal theory, we might refer to it as like co-regulation, right? If you're in the presence of someone with a well-regulated nervous system, that will actually start to help you kind of regulate your nervous system as well. And so I think that it is very important, regardless of the particular modality or model that you're using, for the therapist to have worked through a lot of their own stuff and gone through their own therapy. And I think that even more so with psychedelic therapy, because the stakes, in a sense, are a lot higher. The levels of activation and vulnerability is a lot higher. And so I think that, yeah, it's absolutely imperative for the therapist, certainly within this model, to have done their own work and to have had experiences with those medicines as well, right? I mean, I have come across, just kind of anecdotally, examples or had conversations with people a little bit deeper in the field who have, who can say that there are therapists out there who might be, kind of working in a psychedelic assisted therapy modality and haven't actually gone through the experiences themselves. And I think that they actually, might be kind of detrimental, not necessarily. I mean, there may be individual cases where they're still able to handle things, but just kind of in general, I think it's really important, especially as psychedelics are kind of, a little bit iffy in a sense, right? They're not totally legalized, and as there's a significant spotlight on how these are playing out as we're starting to legalize and how these therapies are going to go. And so I think it's very important for the therapists to have done their own work so that they can really, do the best that they can in these situations. And so that it kind of really shows the benefit of these medicines and, avoids as much as possible any complications.
Yeah, it's kind of specific for psychedelics that the headspace that you get into is so unique that, how would you even describe that to someone? Like, I think somebody who then practice as a practitioner or facilitator and have never been in that state, how would they be able to connect with people that are under the influence of psychedelics? It's just such a unique space that you know how it is. You could describe it for hundreds of hours to somebody, but it doesn't do justice of the thing itself. Which, I mean, I guess it's on the one hand a weird requirement, for somebody to have psychedelic experience, but on the other hand, if you work with these tools, you should know the tool, kind of thing. Maybe I want to diverge into a bit of a different topic, but also like related to this white paper specifically. So this modality seems really great, yet I think it is not spread that widely. There's not so many therapists there, and I'm always for kind of taking maybe some learnings that they came up with, maybe in particular for dissociative states, or if somebody knows that they're in a free state, often that they go back into fight or flight, they go into the dissociative state. Do you think there's anything to be drawn out from, whatever they learned and laid out in the white paper that is applicable to, individuals like outside of therapy, or you think it's something that should be left in therapy?
I mean, I tend to be a bit more on the DIY side of things myself, and so I'm kind of keen on taking out all of the gems that I can, all of the learnings that I can, and applying them to my own life, and of course, just with the caveat that, to exercise caution and make sure you're in a safe environment, regardless of how you choose to use these things. And of course, that's not to downplay the efficacy of using it within a therapeutic context, right? And it can be essential, I think, to have a guide. But in particular, some of the most important learnings that I kind of take away from this model is, first of all, that as we're coming out of dissociation, we may actually move into what are kind of outwardly and perhaps experienced inwardly as more disruptive states, right? So when you're in that kind of numbed state, you're still potentially, your mental capacity is still pretty much online for the most part, right? You're just kind of numbed out. And so you might not even really know. It might be very, very transparent to you, and unless maybe you've had some psychedelic experiences, for example, and recognize actually, most of the time my body does not feel very alive. I do not feel very present, and maybe meditation even. But basically just kind of, I guess, okay, kind of stepping back before I get on like a super tangent. The main kind of key takeaways for me, I think, are if you're coming out of a deeply dissociative state, you may first get into like this manic waves of like panic, and then you might get into like full-blown panic right before you actually return to homeostasis. And that kind of ramping up might be very unsettling, but it is also potentially what your physiology needs to go through to kind of unwind these deep traumatic, deeply imprinted states. So that's kind of one of the main learnings. And kind of a corollary with that is that when you're moving through this, it can be very beneficial to not self-soothe, right? To not try to calm yourself down and to kind of just let your body, kind of give yourself over to the body's intelligence and, kind of maybe tune out what your mind might be trying to encourage you towards, like self-soothing. So I think that's another really important aspect of this model, important learning. And then also the relational aspect in terms of, especially with like childhood traumas, that those traumas may have involved relationships with other people, and that it is potentially most beneficial in terms of working through that to work with someone else, right? Because if it was kind of imprinted in a relational situation, then moving through it, it may to some degree require a relational solution, I guess you could say. So I think those are my main takeaways from this, as far as like how you might be able to apply it in your own life, or just particular insights.
I guess this is coming from a point where I think that I always believe that these kind of things could be perhaps democratized, in a sense that, I don't know, I have this understanding of this kind of McKenna-esque understanding of even psychedelics, where I think that it's kind of our birthright to use these tools. And in the same way, I think it's our birthright to explore consciousness with meditation, with all of these modalities. And I understand that there, are certain steps and that they should be legalized, that this is an important part of the process. But kind of bottom line, my opinion is always, I think all of these things should be just available for anybody. And anybody should be in charge of their body and what they want to do with their body and their consciousness, which I know is maybe for some people a bit extreme, and I agree with that. And in the same way, I think that what is still missing a little bit, like in this whole space, is to make this accessible also for the individual that either cannot afford therapy or maybe doesn't have access to it just because, for example, this is developed in the US and it's just not available in their country or whatever. And there has been some attempts of achieving that. So there's one, for example, protocol you can find online specifically for MDMA. It's called MDMA Solo, and which has been written I guess by an unknown person, like it's written under a pseudonym, but of somebody attempting to like democratize the tool for solo use and try to kind of find a safe protocol how this could still be useful, without the risk or without like derating, I guess, completely. And I'm wondering, could there be a model which maybe is, I don't know, more cautious, or maybe it works in a different way than this relational model where, it could be accessible for anybody who is willing to kind of face their shadows, face their own trauma, and who feel that they are ready to do this, that, they have gained enough distance from the event, maybe stuff that happened in childhood, now they're grown up and they realize that, these things will not break them necessarily. Could we develop kind of a model which would work for people without therapists, kind of?
Yeah, I totally think so. And I think, I've kind of referenced it before, but kind of combining different modalities can kind of, I think, get us closer to this. So one of the things, as you were talking, that obviously came to mind was TRE, right? The tremoring. And that lends itself very well to, kind of being complementary to this model. And I think overall, there is the potential to use a model like this in a solo environment. And I think one of the keys to being able to do that would be around basically educating yourself really well and understanding like very thoroughly what this looks like and how this is going to play out. So for example, and the idea here being kind of to avert some of the potential risks. So for example, one of the risks being that as you're moving out of this highly dissociated state, as you're moving into kind of the manic state, there are symptoms such as suicidal thinking that comes up, right? And to have the education and understanding that this isn't necessarily something that I should be acting on or engaging with or necessarily being overly upset about, but rather this is potentially a sign, a symptom of, my progression through this defense cascade model, right? And so I think the more that someone can be really educated and understand these models and be able to map them to their own experience and say like, okay, yeah, I know what this feels like. I mean, personally, occasionally experiencing suicidal thoughts myself, I've come to the point where I just see that as an indicator of the state of my nervous system. It really doesn't bother me very much. I just see it as like, okay, this is telling me something. This isn't something to get overly entangled in. This is really just an indicator. It's a warning light telling me the state of myself, right? And I think being able to kind of detach from what's going on within you, right? And so something like being well practiced in meditation can be very beneficial, where you're capable of just observing what's happening. I think that can be really key to being able to employ these models on an individual level. So I think, yeah, that we can definitely democratize this. It just requires, a little bit more safeguards and probably a little bit more understanding on the side of the practitioner, on the side of the person who's doing this with themselves, in order to move through it successfully and safely.
I mean, that would be an interesting question, actually. I'm curious, like, what Saj himself would think about this. Maybe there's a way we can get him on the podcast and, maybe even like talk about these kind of things, as this model seems really valuable and it seems really effective as well, right? So it's a way that, skips years of talk therapy and like reflection and building a relationship, and goes like straight to the point and is apparently able to help people. But it's interesting that we are even able to map this out. So whatever traumatic event happened for people, it seems that there is, this curve that we can draw where it's like always the same, and we just need to, approach it in the same way, and can resolve so many different types of trauma. It's just fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. I really like this model, and it resonates in a lot of ways since we've talked about things like polyvagal theory. And I think one of the benefits of kind of this defense cascade type model over the polyvagal theory is it provides more of a clear progression, right? Whereas in polyvagal theory, it kind of seems like, well, you can jump between all the different states and there might not be a clear progression between them. I think the value here is potentially in that progression. But of course, that's not to say that we totally know, right? Like, okay, maybe there are instances where someone moves from a state 4 to a state 1 or a state 0 and kind of skips those intermediary states. I'm not entirely sure.
Right.
But, yeah.
Is there any more tangents that you or anything that we didn't touch based on this white paper?
I suppose just another word or aside around this idea of primary and secondary consciousness, just to kind of flesh that out a tiny bit more. And basically just that the primary consciousness within this context is kind of being referred to as like the default animal type consciousness and not so much the thinking consciousness. And the secondary consciousness being kind of that thinking, that mental, that very mind heavy type consciousness where it's almost disembodied in a sense. And the idea with this model is really to allow the primary consciousness kind of reign over what's happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's crazy that people are even able to stay in primary consciousness if those things happen to them. So is there, when people, for example, had experienced trauma in the past, are they always in state 2 consciousness or are they still in default mode?
Yeah, I don't know if I can totally answer that, from the context or from the perspective of this model, but my understanding, and I guess in my own experience, and also kind of relating this idea of primary consciousness back to psychedelics, it's been going through my mind a lot recently that in a sense, psychedelics really kind of awaken the primary consciousness and allow you to become more embodied in a sense. And I think that's one of the reasons that cannabis in particular is very effective, because it moves you into that kind of embodied primary consciousness without some of the confusion in the secondary consciousness that is often elicited by some of the more powerful psychedelics, right? But to your question, can we kind of live in secondary consciousness? And I guess actually, from the perspective of the model, they do say that, yeah, or kind of essentially, yes, we are capable of existing mainly in secondary consciousness, and honestly, probably most of us do. Most of us are probably walking around kind of a floating, disembodied head, right? I don't know, maybe you can relate to that. I know that I can. I guess I shouldn't speak to other people's experience.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's, I guess what we would call in psychology the default mode network. It's kind of what, keeps us together. And what also saves a lot of brain power is just, if we would compute every interaction with reality that we have, the brain would probably be completely overpowered. So, there's this mechanism which holds it together, but which also contributes to less awareness. And, it would be interesting. We get these glimpses of expanded states of consciousness where it seems that mode is just, it's shut off and put to rest for a minute, and you basically get to exist with completely new input coming in, and it's this interesting experience of like experiencing life for the first time. But then eventually you need to go back to the battery saving mode of the default mode network. Otherwise, probably we could not function. But obviously it's an interesting undertaking of, can there be more moments in my life where I'm not running on default, but where I'm like actually experiencing and where I have like more awareness. And trauma definitely seems to be a contributor of like keeping us stuck in the default mode network. So I believe, or my assumption would be that as people, resolve these problematic states in the nervous system, that they also regain more awareness in their life, right? Because they're not so bound through dissociation to this like default way of functioning. And I guess ultimately that's the benefit that people will have, that their life will, be more present, more aware at the end.
Yeah, a lot more richness in your life. And actually, to speak a little bit to this kind of battery saving mode, I think that we're actually draining more of our energy. And they talk about this a little bit in PSIP, that by being stuck in like this state 4, by kind of being stuck in this disembodied state, there's a certain dissonance between primary consciousness and secondary consciousness, and that is actually very draining in and of itself. And I think, although, initially when we start to become more embodied, it may feel very draining. I think that is a consequence of this dissonance. It's kind of a consequence of, I guess you could say, like faulty neuroception. You could say kind of a faulty interpretation, essentially, right? Where it just becomes kind of overwhelming almost. And it's because we kind of have a habitual interpretation of that information that comes from primary consciousness, right? And that interpretation is very draining in a sense, that it's almost incorrect in a sense. And certainly, like in my psychedelic experiences, I find a lot of vigor. I find myself very invigorated, and I think that to some degree that's coming from kind of almost, I don't know if synergy is quite the right word that I'm looking for, but almost coming from primary and secondary consciousness kind of coming into harmony, I guess it would be a good word to use there. And that normally, certainly if you're stuck in a disembodied state, that there's a certain amount of disharmony, that there's a certain amount of kind of incongruence between those states. And it's in that incongruence that is actually draining us. And it's not so much, that primary consciousness in and of itself is draining.
Yeah, for sure, it's draining. I mean, it even manifests in the body as tension a lot of the times. Like we talked so much about the correlation as well with like keeping emotions at bay and like tension in your body. So we have this energy costing thing on a somatic level as well on a psychological level. And perhaps on a psychological level, it's even more draining because like anybody who meditated might have learned that you cannot really control your thoughts. It's like very difficult to hold a thought away down. It's like, don't think of the pink elephant. For sure, you're going to think about it.
Right.
Kind of thing. And it's more about like being fine with thoughts being there and then they'll eventually resolve. And if you think about it, how difficult that is with like a single thought that you want to suppress, and it's like almost impossible. Well, imagine your consciousness is keeping this really important event at bay, away from you. And, it's kind of like keeping the balloon under the water psychologically. And yeah, I believe it's super draining. And it's why it reduces your awareness, and it's why your life can become, I believe, very dull and like it's kind of this tunnel thing that cuts out all the lows and the highs, because it's just your consciousness is busy with keeping this this event from you. So yeah, perhaps like the battery saving analogy is not that accurate. Maybe more something like emergency mode or like safety boot that you're in. You just have like the minimal capacity to do the things that you need to do, but all the richness is not there. So yeah, I guess that's the promise of coming out of this mode results in more awareness, both like somatically and psychologically.
Yeah, really well put. I don't think I'd add anything else.